So my name is Rigel. I've developed a lot of code for the Cosmos ecosystem, if you're aware with that. Basically, there's lots of cool blockchain, inter-blockchain communication. How can you have small little blockchains that interact with each other to create a larger system, whereby each individual autonomous blockchain really has sovereignty over itself. And therefore there's going to be a little bit less contention if a blockchain wants to completely reinvent itself. And a blockchain can really just be thought of as synonymous to a community. That's stuff I've done in the past. And where am I going is I'm pretty much planning on implementing over the next maybe year or two a lot of the things I'm going to talk with you guys about today, which is qualified value structures. So kind of where I'm going to begin is talking about what quantification is and what quantification is in reference to resource management. And then I'm going to try to spend roughly half the time on qualification too. So my whole thing on quantification is heavily opinionated. But I'm just going to try not to spend too much time. But if you have quarrels with it, that's cool, and we can talk about those. Quantification, quantified value structures. Quantification is kind of fundamentally about abstraction of value. So, let's take some unique thing, be it, an opportunity or, some oil or some oxygen in the atmosphere, and let's just kind of abstract that into some kind of quantifiable unit, which is now liquefied, so to speak, such that that can be readily potentially exchanged on any system or compared to one another. So that's kind of like the general idea of quantification. We're all familiar with it. Money is the ultimate quantification that we live by. One thing that occurs, so I'm just going to admit people here. One thing that occurs when we quantify is we oversimplify, we potentially oversimplify what's actually happening, or like what the value actually is. One of the most common ways that we oversimplify a value is we just kind of forget about the associated potentially debt value attributed to a resource. So plain classic one is well, you buy oil and then you burn oil, and in the process of burning the oil, you're effectively producing environmental debt, which is typically unquantified for. And that debt is kind of like a global debt, right? It's not like, any individual, it's not like you're just handing this debt to an individual person. It's somehow everybody in the future is paying for this small externality. Yeah, so a lot of the externalizations, for instance with oil, are really hard to quantify to begin with. What does that debt look like? When does it actually even come into play? So a kind of alternative thinking approach is just trying to qualify those debts at the source, if it's possible. Okay, another important thing we have to remember about quantification is, as we quantify, principles of consolidation, typically apply. I think that I'm just going to guess, I don't really know, but I think that as commodities become a little bit more liquid, their capacity for consolidation probably increases. I don't know, that's just my guess, open to debate. Now, consolidation is fine and arguably is sometimes like really beneficial, right? Like if, this is a classic problem with, government intervention and like sometimes like land reforms, right? Is you'll have potentially like a government somewhere. I think this happened in like South Africa that was like, well, we don't like how land has consolidated and accumulated, and we are going to change. We're just gonna artificially come in and we're just gonna change the ownership structures. And what has happened, this is like the classic thing. This is what happened in Ukraine with the USSR as well. Is you just basically had like these wealthy farmers who owned a lot of land, having the land taken away from them, and then the land being improperly used. So in that kind of a situation, the wealth had consolidated to people based on the goodness of the utilization of those collective resources, and because of that, they were able to produce more for everybody in the case of food. And if that was taken away, as it was, then you would basically have massive famine and starvation. So there's like, sometimes it's good to consolidate, but then sometimes it gets really fucked up. Like I think what's happening in the States right now is like pretty clear. There's just insane wealth at like some very like thin layer, whereby the actual processes of democracy are becoming eroded via the capability of those with wealth to simply buy the power, and change laws through lobbying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're kind of like in this weird like tug where it's like, okay, well, what's the balance? What's the most appropriate way to what's the most appropriate way for resources to be distributed? It's definitely not complete consolidation, and it's probably not total distribution. So it's kind of like where I'm trying to go with this and where I'm trying to bring my thinking is like, how do we effectively qualify the most appropriate use for resources such that we can like kind of like collectively agree like, okay, this is what we should be doing. This, maybe we're going to be, offering up authority of all sorts of resources to, private individuals who are really good at doing certain things for some other form of qualitative compensation. Yeah, so I'm just going to take a breather for a second. Sorry, can you say
no, I was just saying it's an interesting idea, but I would disagree on it to a certain extent. By the way, I'm from Toronto as well. The reason why is because you have that expectation hypothesis, the expectation whether the resource will exist or not. So the value of the resource is not today, but rather the expectation whether it will be available to use tomorrow or day after. And because of climate in the middle and the uncertainty of the environment, you then have value arbitrage. And therefore, you'll never have what you call, and the equilibrium means there's certain haves and there's have-nots, right? It's just the way it is because the supply demand, it's an X. So from the resource perspective, that's my thinking, that just because of the risks associated with it, that you'll never have equitable distribution.
Yeah, no, I don't think that. I don't think. I mean, this is one of the things I said, right? I don't think just like a complete uniform distribution makes any fucking sense. But I do think that there's a problem associated if you have too much liquidity in the resources such that the consolidation is driven to an extremely high point. I think what happens as the consolidation gets driven to higher and higher points, equality of opportunities is kind of lost out on. So all I'm trying to say is like, I think we kind of need to slow that process down. And that's what, you know, in the past that's the conception of like a lot of government regulation, right? Is like, how do we make it so that, you know, if you're just getting way too fucking rich, how do we distribute some of that opportunity? But I think that that's kind of also been failing us. And I think that that's a problem that's rooted in how the governments are actually organizing themselves, and like how they're using the resources that they're taking on everybody's behalf. But that's kind of like, anyways, can I just keep going here? Or?
Yeah, I
Okay.
suppose.
I think, yeah, so it's like about the 15-minute mark. I want to keep it like really cut and shy. So
with the shipping of, for example, for goods, right?
Yeah.
Being economized, therefore now you can consume at any point of the globe and have it shipped pretty quickly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So from a final good perspective, you've got that utility, but it surpasses national boundaries. You know what I mean? In terms of tax. So therefore the redistribution of that, even in terms of information, if information's a commodity, right? How do you charge that? And then I've moved to London a couple of years ago, and here France is, for example, looking at taxing, say, search revenue that's derived on French property. Now, how do you define that on a virtual environment versus, I guess, material environment? You know what I mean? So it's an interesting debate they're having over here.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely complicated. Like, I think that, I mean, that's kind of one of the big problems is that these problems are so complicated. And when you have like a single centralized entity that is just kind of tasked with, you know, the responsibility of figuring it all out, it becomes, I don't know, I think that it's just like a difficult problem and it's not always solved properly. So like part of the thinking with like qualified value structures is how do you break open that process? How do you break open the process of just like qualifying, like what is right to do? What laws should we actually have that are going to benefit everyone? And how should we use those collective resources that truly are collective, you know, within a certain geographical region? Or it can even be a decentralized community, right? Like you can have it, like this is a classic problem with like Cosmos right now, is like Cosmos is like this decentralized blockchain, and the public asset is kind of the permission rights on the code base, right? It's like who has the authority to push to the code base and change, you know, or it's the same thing with Bitcoin, right? It's like, well, it's just kind of like this tug and pull, and there are like these centralized GitHub repositories that have like private owners, and then that's kind of like the resource that is being hoarded. So I just kind of want to move on to like some of the thinking around like qualification now. A part of like I guess my segue is a part of the premise behind a lot of quantification is like the movement of resources via an invisible hand that's kind of like holstered up from purportedly rational actors. So, you know, to me, it's kind of like fine because like, okay, we know that like on a certain level, quantification seems to work. We seem to have been doing this for like a really long time. You know, there's obviously like a lot of changes in quantification and like resource management today. Like for instance, historically, there hasn't been a shit ton of speculation. Historically, externalized environmental factors, externalized debt hasn't really mattered because, you know, we haven't been at capacity. And there's also like, you know, I think there was a time when kings would pardon debt. I'm not sure. But like, that's a factor. Today, you know, we have this magical hand that we say moves resources around, and it does. Resources are being moved around. but I don't think that the premise that people are rational is valid. And I think that like not as individuals nor as averages of the individual actions do I think resource management is actually done in a rational way given the existing state of the world, which is just complete catastrophe environmentally, socially, politically. Like there's a lot of problems that I think are somehow, sorry, was somebody saying something? Ah, cool. I think that they're somehow probably tied back to, you know, how we've been doing this resource management. And, you know, I guess like if people were rational, a lot of these problems that we have today probably wouldn't exist. So I'm just gonna like say like, okay, like if what we're working with are just like fundamentally, you know, maybe not perfectly rational individuals, how are we gonna now create a rational framework to manage our resources from? Sorry, can somebody mute? I'm hearing like some feedback. I think Steve. Oh, I can mute you. I just muted you. Okay. Okay. So like what does, you know, qualification look like? To me, it's, you know, if you haven't already figured it out, it's very similar to the idea of like decentralized governance, right? Or like just like, you know, sovereignty, like actual democracy. It doesn't necessarily have to be decentralized. It just seems that like, you know, that's like a really nice way to implement it. So, okay, qualification, visible hand. So I think through the use of explicit language, an explicit democratized framework driven towards consensus whenever possible, as well as a cohesive community, and that's important, an alternative collective management strategy of resources can take place. So I think like one of the most important, you know, processes as a part of qualification is the use of explicit language. So I think that explicit language is the foundation of a non-contentious baseline of agreements of what is what, a basic parsing of a reality of what resources within a given domain or geography are in fact shared resources, what the implications for the present and the future of either the destruction of, the management of, or the complete reimagine of those resources looks like. And I think that like that process that I just described is the core of the qualification process. Yeah, is just like we just have to open it up. We have to open up the discussion. That discussion happens in closed doors right now. It's really difficult to like actually have my voice have, you know, even if I am only 1 in a million, right? Like where is my 1 in a million voice on like literally everything around me that like all the rules around me? How do I say like I don't like this rule and have my vote recorded and count? You just like simply can't in most government jurisdictions that I'm aware of. Maybe like Switzerland you can. That's pretty cool, but like not here.
Yeah, cantons.
Yeah.
Cantons have to vote to even allow a single individual to come into the canton to be a citizen, for example. So
Yeah.
it's really Republican that way.
That's crazy. Like I heard that in some places you even just like there's literally town halls where people vote with their hands.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. But like, so like that's one of the cool things about like the Swiss cantons is that they are cohesive. And I think that like the small region in which is governed by a canton, I mean relatively small, is what allows for a lot of that cohesion, right? And I think that this kind of principle of cohesion is really important if consensus is going to be reached on a lot of things. I think it's like really difficult to have a conversation with 1 million people. But it is, you know, you can have a conversation with everybody on your block. You can literally do that. And, you know, through having more interaction space, you're going to have a larger capability to arrive at consensus. And then when you arrive at consensus, then you're able to, you know, say, you know, okay, so I have a cool, interesting point here. So broad-based consensus procedures within a community serve to legitimize the the decisions made by that community. That itself, combined with self-sufficiency and proper healthcare/security, form the basis of legitimate autonomy, whereby the legitimate authority over shared resources within a domain can be asserted or proposed to other structures. Yeah, so, you know, that's the idea. Okay, here's just like another brain dump for you.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, you just, let's talk. I've just been ranting here. I'm sorry. Please
No
interrupt me.
So my PhD thesis / trading strategy that we built was on using proxies to aggregate behavioral biases that sort of exist in herd environments, right? So let's just say you take individuals, you make them into a collective, how that collective behaves as a community, for example, right? So when you have users of resources, they will, there's volatility within their behavior. What we try to look at is how, if those biases were predictable, right? So they come up actually according to several patterns within those sequences. So say oil, right? Or natural gas. You're looking at weather patterns and you're looking at its price volatility, etc. Now, where it changed was, so here there's large actors such as natural gas producers and utilities, right? In terms of price, and we're just paying for it. However, information democratization worked against it. So it would make people irrational, and so the rational choice theory stopped to exist. But within a shorter period of time, until the system would impose penalties on them for that transaction. So for just to, in numbers, your S&P 500 would respond because of Donald Trump tweet or something, and then that tweet had no relevance. So in a longer period of time, the values would inflect back, right? We started that in sugarcane, in wheat, in oil, in all other commodities. And what I was saying was, while there was non-democratization here, information democratization worked against it, because it gave freedom to even that single voice who, I shouldn't say shouldn't have had it, but expresses an opinion or gets to the loudspeaker. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so how that communion between the two works is quite, I guess, volatile, to be honest.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So like, one of the things I think is really important as well in any kind of a decentralized structure that exists is the democratization of the information flow within that structure. So like just newsfeed algorithms, period, that bring information to people before other information, if everybody's like fucking hooked in, wired into all sorts of social media bullshit. Those new feeds are incredibly powerful. And they're powerful at changing opinions. What?
How do you validate?
How do you validate the information?
Validate the information.
Yeah, well, I mean, so like this is, I think, what itself needs to be opened up, but that's like a really large problem. Like, first of all, you need to get people on a platform, right, where these types of things are open, which is like right now, all the platforms are just purely privately owned. I don't think it would be too complicated to like build a new one that's good, but like the actual movement of all that social inertia onto another platform is like that's a stupendous task that is like, I don't even know exactly how that's going to happen. I have some ideas anyways. But yeah, so like if you have the democratization of how information is allowed to flow, then I think you can have a little bit more movement towards you know, what is true information. But that depends on the ability to have an underlying structure to evaluate how the structure itself should change.
Sure.
So it's kind of like there's like these layers of abstraction that need to be in place for an effective democratization of the information networks. But I think that that itself is really important. If you're going to have a larger structure that is based on any kind of like qualification process, even just changing laws, like forget about value structures. If we're just going to change the fundamental laws of how we are to an open system where a lot of people have to be interacting with these systems, how that information flows is drop dead vital. Yeah, so I guess like I think this is like a 2-minute left type deal. Can I get a convo on that? Somebody? Yeah. This is a half-an-hour session, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So there's 2 minutes left. So I'm just gonna state my concluding facts here. Also, I'm just gonna also type my email into it. Okay. So, sorry, I'm just gonna be a total. Okay, so can I message everybody in my email? Okay, yeah, Rigel.Rozanski@gmail.com. So anybody feel free to message me. If you program Go, please message me. So yeah, so like what I'm proposing or what I'm thinking probably makes sense is like there's no way in this world that the qualification process is something that, you know, any large kind of structure of people is going to take up anytime soon. I don't think. I think that there's like a real emotional attachment that people have to quantified value, and people are just going to keep using money, and you can't really stop them. If people are going to use money, they're going to use money, and that's fine. But I do think what is possible is I think it is possible to open up certain resources to the qualified procedure, such as the resource of air that everybody shares. And more broadly speaking, to a really fair and just decentralized governance procedure that actually performs the qualification of these resources. So I'm thinking there's like kind of like a right hand, left hand approach, right? You have like the invisible hand of the market that's moving, and then you have like more of like a visible, explicit hand of qualification that's moving at the same time. So I think that there's something kind of cool in the middle ground, and I don't know. These are just ideas, right? So it's going to be really exciting how all sorts of these types of ideas, just towards decentralization generally, quantified and qualified, move forward. But I think that there's this mindset that prevails right now in the blockchain space, which is of quantification, which makes sense. But I'm just trying to like get people thinking a little bit more as to like, well, like, is that the only way? And like, are there disadvantages to a completely different reimagination of these systems? So I'm just going to shut up. That's it. And thanks for listening.